You're going to start.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. And Susie, welcome to San Francisco.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here.
And we're going to discuss and talk about your book, which is right here in front of us. And you start your book with two short anecdotes that in a way explain your motivation behind writing this book. So can you share with us those anecdotes?
Yeah, I mean, my book came out of several experiences. One of them was my previous book about photography and political violence. And I had a chapter in that book on Robert Capa, who was the most famous leftist photojournalist of the 20th century. Capa was very, very pro-Israel in 1948. He went to Israel with I.F. Stone to document the emergence of the state. He actually thought about settling in Israel. And he was the most famous photographer of the Spanish Civil War. He came out of the anti-fascist left. And many leftists of that time, I.F. Stone and many others, were very pro-Israel. And they viewed the Arab countries fighting against Israel as these really reactionary feudal monarchies. And they viewed Britain as the big imperialist in the Middle East. Now, of course, the view of Israel has changed a lot among the left. But I was really struck by how pro-Zionist, pro-Israel the left, most of the left, not all of the left, but the overwhelming majority of the left at that time was. And I started thinking about the changes, why the changes, and of course part of it has to do with the occupation and Israel itself. I'll talk about that a little, but as I thought about it more, I thought that can't be the whole story. Because first off, the Zionism and the birth of Israel were very controversial in the left way before there was an occupation. So there had to be more to the story than that. And quite a few years ago, I was at a dinner with my partner, with various other leftist academics, and the name of a very famous journalist, who probably the most famous journalist in America in terms of writing about the genocide in Africa, was mentioned. And someone said very disparagingly, "Oh, he's a Zionist." And everyone else was like, "Oh, terrible, terrible, terrible." And I was really struck by that. I was like, whoa. It's almost as if he'd said he was a fascist or he was a pedophile, just the total disgust of everyone at the table. And I sort of took a cowardly gulp and said, well, I am too. I believe in a state for the Jewish people. And everyone was, oof. There was dead silence, and everyone looked very sympathetically with a lot of pity at my partner. Like, how did you end up with this gal? So that really struck me. I was like, wow, this is really what the conventional wisdom is among leftist intellectuals. And around the same time, I made a trip to Israel, one of several trips I've made, and I went with a group called Partners for Progressive Israel, which is aligned with Meretz, but it's a U.S. organization. And we went to Hebron, which of course is a Palestinian city. Tens of thousands of Palestinians live there, and there's a few hundred ultra rightist settlers who have settled there and really destroyed the city. And as we were walking through it, through Hebron, we were walking on a street, and there's literally a dividing line. And there were small Palestinian boys sort of scampering next to us, and they literally were not allowed to cross that line. They weren't allowed to walk on the same road that we were walking on. And I felt ashamed to be a Jew for the first time in my life. So the book was sort of born out of those two experiences, and the previous book of both a kind of sadness about how viscerally anti-Israel the left has become, but also a great sadness about the trajectory of Israel itself. And so I started wondering about if there had been a different and richer conversation in the 20th century about these questions than the one that exists today. And that's really what led me to the research of the book.
And you go back in time and you write, so there are 8 chapters in this book, and each chapter deals with a different intellectual, different thinker, and their own kind of struggle with the idea of Zionism and the state of Israel?
Exactly. I think I can honestly say, first off, Israel and Zionism have always been sort of an obsession of the left. And that's partially because there are a lot of Jews in the left, but not only because of that. And I also tried to figure that out in the book. But yeah, the book is, there are 10 chapters, but there are 8 thinkers discussed. And I think it is fair to say that each of them really went through a lot of struggle and a lot of changes in terms of their relationship to Zionism and to Israel. Everyone thinks that the Six-Day War was sort of the great turning point, and there's some truth to that, but the story is much, much more complicated than that. So the first person that I write about is Hannah Arendt, who these days is sort of lauded by critics of Israel, believing that she was that she's anti-Israel or that she was anti-Zionist. In fact, she was a very, very, very strong Zionist. For many years. She did oppose the founding of a state, and I might read a little bit about that. But she was very, very strong Zionist, at least from 1933 to 1948, and a militant Zionist. She lobbied very hard, for instance, for she wanted there to be a Jewish army in World War II fighting as Jews from the Yishuv. And so her whole relationship to Zionism, to Jewishness, then later on to the Eichmann trial is, I think, quite tormented in many ways. And I was interested in her struggle. The second person is Arthur Kessler, who was sort of in the center of many of the great political struggles of the 20th century. He was also a complete nut, and he was sort of the most fun person to write about because his neuroses about being Jewish were so intertwined with his politics. He was a very staunch communist, then he became a super anti-communist. He was a very staunch Zionist, although a right-wing one. Then he became very anti-Zionist. Then he decided that he really liked Israel because he thought it was a very un-Jewish place. He associated Jewishness with cowardice, with sexual neurosis, all of which was true of him. So I was interested in how he was really an anti-Semite. Can you be an anti-Semite and also be a Zionist? So he's my second chapter. And then I write about 4 socialists who are better known in Europe than they are here. The first is Maxim Rodinson, who was a communist, capital C. His parents were Russian immigrants, as he described them, Stalinists, real Bolsheviks. He was a scholar of the Arab world, and very, very anti-Zionist, even after his own parents were murdered in Auschwitz. But he was very, very knowledgeable about the Arab world, which of course is very much a part of this story. The second is Isaac Deutscher, who some of you may have read, the famous biographer of Leon Trotsky. Like Rodinson, he was a Marxist, but a different kind of Marxist. In fact, they didn't agree at all on Marxism. But he was a very strong Marxist, and in some ways was anti-Zionist, but was very different from Rodinson because first off, the Holocaust really changed him. His whole family was murdered in Auschwitz, and that really changed him. Second of all, he went to Israel quite frequently. He had a half-sister who had gone to Palestine in the 1920s or 30s, I think in the 1930s. She was, I think, the only person in the family who survived. And he went to Israel quite frequently. And although he was sort of ideologically against Zionism, he was so impressed and moved by Israel. And he thought that especially the kibbutzim, which he thought was really the purest socialism that the world had ever seen. The third writer is very famous in France, not known here, is named Albert Memy. And Memy was a Tunisian Jew, came from a very, very poor family, and was very, very involved in the anti-colonial movement in Tunisia and the independence movement. And he was a very, very strong anti-colonialist, really before France went on. But he was also a very, very strong Zionist, and he viewed Zionism as also an anti-colonial movement, as a movement for self-determination. And his views of the Arab world, having come from it, tended to be very different than that of many other writers. He was quite shocked when Tunisia gained independence. He expected it to become sort of like France, like a France of the Middle East. And he was quite shocked when he realized that Tunisian Jews who had lived in the country for about 2,000 years were not considered Tunisian, were not considered really Jewish, and basically all of them were expelled or left. The fourth person I discuss in this socialist segment is Fred Halliday, also very well known in Europe. He also was a scholar of the Arab world, but of a younger generation. He really came of age in 1968. He was very much a part of the New Left. He started out being very, very pro-Palestinian, very, very pro-Third World. The first piece he ever wrote in terms of the conflict was an interview with the head of the PLF, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who was a terrorist, and in fact was assassinated by the Mossad about 2 years later. But his views really begin to change, because first off, he starts really looking at the Arab world and how what he thought would be a kind of democratic socialist revolutions in the Arab world had gone so terribly wrong. And you had, Saddam, you had Assad, you had the rise of these terrible, terrible dictatorships. He was also in Iran at the time of the revolution there and was quite shocked to see this revolution that he thought would be a great anti-imperialist revolution actually become a reactionary revolution, and its attack on women, the left, etc. So his ideas on Israel and Palestine began to really, really change. And he was quite courageous. He really broke with his leftist colleagues, with his Marxist colleagues in Britain, and became very, very much a proponent of two states, very critical of the left's embrace, or at least rationalization, of terrorism. The last two chapters are on Americans, one I.F. Stone, famous left-wing journalist, fighter of McCarthyism. Stone also goes to what was then Palestine right after World War II, is very, very pro-Israel, believes very much in the founding of a Jewish state, becomes much more disillusioned with Israel after '67, and was very wrong about many things, I think, but was very prescient about the fact that the Palestinian refugees would really become the issue, the moral issue and the political issue. And the last is Noam Chomsky, who's very influential, especially among young people. I teach at NYU. Many students who have never read any other leftist read Noam Chomsky. And researching Chomsky was quite shocking, actually. Because as I researched his writings, I realized that almost everything that he's written about Israel and Palestine after a certain point is actually completely and utterly fraudulent. And when I went back to look at the original documents that he was writing about, I was actually quite staggered at either what are at most gross misrepresentations and perhaps outright lies. But I felt that it was important to write about him because he is such an influential person on the left even today. He's also anti-BDS, which is also sort of interesting. He's very, very critical of Israel. He has a very crazy view of the Arab world, but he's anti-BDS. So those are the people that I discuss. In some ways, it's just a very subjective group. These are people who interest me. Somebody else, I guess, could write a book and choose very different writers.
So we'll talk about the way you chose a little bit later on, but can you please read for us a few excerpts so we'll get a taste?
I'm going to read a little bit for a taste. First, I wanted to read just a quote from a writer named Mervyn Jones. He was a British writer. He was a British socialist, originally in the Communist Party, left the Communist Party, became a socialist. And he wrote the following in 1970, and this was sort of one of the guiding ideas of my book. He's talking about the whole question of Zionism. He wrote, "One cannot easily recall another problem over which socialists of good faith have disagreed so much. disagreed in their sympathies, disagreed over possible solutions, disagreed in finding a way to apply basic socialist principles, disagreed in analysis of the very nature of the problem. The maxim of, "Tell me where my enemies stand, and I'll know where I stand," however useful in other situations, will not guide socialists through this labyrinth. And I think that that is very true of the writers in my book. They agreed on many, many things, but really disagreed bitterly, bitterly, bitterly over the question of Israel and of Zionism. So, as I said, Hannah Arendt was a very, very militant Zionist from 1933 to 1948. I'll read a little bit about Hannah. She wrote, by the way, hundreds of thousands of words about the whole question, the Jewish question. Arendt liked to disparagingly quote the Zionist maxim describing Palestine as a land without a people for a people without a land. Yet by the 1940s, and some would say by 1929 or 1936, few in the Yishuv, from right-wing revisionists to the Marxists of Hashomer Hatzer, believed this. Indeed, in the 19th century, Ahad Ha'am, the influential founder of cultural Zionism, had warned Zionists against ignoring Palestine's Arab majority or underestimating its political intelligence. By Arendt's time, the disagreements, and they were enormous, within the Jewish community in Palestine centered on if and how competing Arab and Jewish rights and claims could be resolved. But few ignored the fact of a conflict between two nations. Beginning in the early 20th century, there were numerous attempts by Arabs, who were not at that time called Palestinians, and Jews to forge some sort of agreement in Palestine. Some of these attempts were cynical, others heartfelt. But in either case, world events pushed the parties further apart as the century progressed. With the rise of Hitler and then the beginning of the genocide, the main Zionist demand became unrestricted Jewish immigration to Palestine. This was utterly necessary for the Jews and, for understandable reasons, utterly anathema to the Arabs. And it would turn out to the British also. This was a clash of basic needs that could not be fudged, evaded, or philosophized away. Even today, or perhaps especially today, critics of Israel refuse to recognize this stubborn, unhappy fact and indulge in the wooziest of retroactive fantasies. British literary critic Jacqueline Rose, for instance, believes that a wonderful binational moment was missed in the pre-state period when, she wrote, quote, Zionism might have created a form of nationhood that would slash away politics, face its own dark beast. Zionism had the opportunity to forge a model of nationhood that would be ambivalent, uncertain, obscure, end quote. The historian Neil Kaplan's multi-volume work on Arab-Jewish negotiations is closer to reality. It is titled, sadly but accurately, Feudal Diplomacy. Still, there is no doubt that Arendt saw the long-term problems of the Arab-Jewish conflict more clearly than some others, and that she insisted they were of central rather than peripheral importance. The heart of the issue was not that Zionism was imperialist or colonialist. Arendt regarded it as neither. Nor did she sentimentalize Palestinian culture or try to blur the vast differences that separated it from the Yishuv. In fact, Arendt's writings on this topic would sound harsh and politically incorrect today. She contrasted what she called the advanced culture and economy of the Zionists to the, quote, hopeless misery and sterility, backwardness and inefficiency, and disease-stricken poverty of Palestinian Arabs, end quote. She believed that Palestine could flourish only with the skills and knowledge the Zionists had brought. She was not a cultural relativist. She wrote, quote, the Arabs had 1,500 years to turn a stony desert into fertile land, whereas the Jews have not had even 40, and the difference is quite remarkable. And she was hardly a fan of the nascent Palestinian national movement, which had, quote, sold itself to German and Italian imperialism and was thoroughly fascist infiltrated, end quote. What Arendt did perceive was the inability of Palestinian Arabs and Jews to see each other's reality, or even to see that the other was real. Quote, in hope or in hate, both peoples have focused their attention so exclusively upon the British that they practically ignored each other. The Jews forgot that the Arabs, not the English, were the permanent reality in Near Eastern policies, and the Arabs forgot that Jewish settlers, and not British troops, intended to stay permanently in Palestine, she wrote in 1948. These mutual miscomprehensions and antipathies were not momentary blips, she warned, but would define the Jewish state. Without an accommodation between Jews and Arabs, Israel would always be imperiled. However, when it came to the time of the partition, Arendt opposed partition, somewhat mysteriously, that took me a long time to try to figure out her thinking on this, which I believe was quite erroneous. One would think that when the Zionists dropped their maximalist program and agreed to the partition of Palestine into interdependent Jewish and Arab states, Arendt, the great proponent of Jewish national emancipation, would have been among their heartiest supporters. Here, finally, was the opportunity to solidify the Jewish world that she so passionately advocated. Here, finally, was the chance to move from pariahdom to politics, from helplessness to self-reliance, from worldlessness to sovereignty. Here, finally, was the opportunity for Jews to forge relations of equality with other nations, upon which she set such great store. And here, finally, was a way to honor the validity of Palestinian Arab national claims. Here was a plan that offered possibilities other than minority status or forced expulsion for either Arabs or Jews. Instead, as 1947 rolled into 1948, Arendt became increasingly vitriolic in her opposition to partition and Jewish sovereignty, even as the nascent Israeli state and her beloved kibbutzim and Hebrew University were under siege and attack by Palestinian militias and then by 5 Arab armies. Arendt's writings from this time show how one shaft of insight can morph into sightlessness when the part is allowed to substitute to the whole. Almost all the judgments she made during this crucial period proved deeply, radically, perplexingly wrong. It was here that she entered what the Marxist sociologist George Lichtheim would characterize in a different context as, quote, Arendt's twilight zone, where it no longer seems to matter whether we are dealing with actual events, end quote. Faced with escalating violence and then outright war between Jews and Arabs, Arendt put forth, with certitude for herself and scorn for others, a series of increasingly impossible, unworkable, and deeply undemocratic solutions. At the crucial historic moment, the moment of existential crisis, Arendt retreated from the worlds of judgment, history, and reality, the world she held most dear. So I'll read a little bit of Deutscher. Deutscher, by the way, was raised in Poland. In a very religiously observant family. Yiddish and Hebrew were his first languages. He was considered a prodigy, and his father expected him to become a rabbi and a great Jewish scholar. Instead, he goes to he becomes an atheist. He rejects not only Orthodox Judaism but religion in whole, although never rejected his identity as a Jew. He goes to Warsaw. He becomes a Marxist. He then moves to England to teach, which saves his life. The rest of his family is murdered in Auschwitz. There is a touch of un-Jewishness about Israel, Deutscher observed after his 1954 visit there. He noticed in particular the strange side of Jewish farmers, Jewish soldiers, and what he called Jewish toughness. Though Deutscher's approach to history was not psychoanalytic, he intuited the dual trauma of many Israelis, in which, quote, a complex and many-sided process of psychological uprooting had combined with tragic processes of physical displacement. Israel, he wrote, is the state of the displaced person. And he noted, though not without sympathy, that displaced people are often damaged people. He wrote, the newcomers are not like the idealist of the previous aliyahs. They are the wrecks of concentration camps, the flotsam and jetsam of European Jewry, and the masses of Oriental Jews, refugees from Arab hatred and revenge, end quote. Israel's national project consisted not just of building modern industry, agriculture, and cultural institutions, but of destroying, quote, all the marks of indignity, all the stigmata of shame, all the yellow patches that Jew hatred has ever devised, end quote. Deutscher understood that this process of creative destruction, but he was hurt that it required the rejection of Yiddish, his beloved native tongue. In the 1954 article titled Israel's Spiritual Climate, Deutscher made clear that there was much in the nascent country that he admired. Quote, there is an egalitarian spirit alive in the working class, he observed. Ever loyal to Trotsky, he added that this ethos, quote, flourished in Soviet Russia before it was eradicated by Stalin. The kibbutzim, especially those in the Galilee, filled him with delight. Quote, he who has not seen the kibbutz can hardly imagine the boldness and originality of the idea and its execution. He viewed the kibbutz as untainted communism in action, far superior in its political economy and human relations to the USSR's collective farms. Slyly, he recounted the story of a Soviet official who visited a kibbutz dominated by the left-wing Mapam party, which at that time religiously followed a pro-Soviet line. The visiting Russian comrade refused to believe that the Zionist commune had no means of, quote, coercive discipline and housed no jail. Deutscher wrote, the Russian did not conceal his incredulity, and he intimated that he thought it a good joke that for once Jews should show their own Potemkin village to a Russian. But many things about the new country worried Deutscher, presciently so. The kibbutzim might be unable to sustain themselves, for the country's new immigrants had no interest in either rural living or the abolition of private property. Some kibbutzim had already been forced to hire outside labor, which was previously taboo. The state was too theocratic, the people too nationalistic. The country's borders were bizarre, contorted by, quote, grotesque corridors, bulges, necks, and triangles carved out by the master carvers of the United Nations, end quote. To Deutscher, this illustrated, quote, the stark madness of the nation state. In Israel, you can never escape its mad stare. Wherever you go, you're always at some frontier or other. Look, on the hill over there are the Syrians. And he might have added the Jordanians, Egyptians, and Lebanese too. In addition, Israeli sovereignty had what he called explosives, the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees, quote, built into its very foundations. He worried about what this meant for the future. And he predicted, to the Arabs, the Jews are and will for long remain invaders and intruders. Although he also wrote, quote, the Jews feel that the injury they have done to the Arabs is child's play compared to their own tragedy. That is true enough, but it does not prevent the Arabs from smarting under their grievance and craving revenge. Deutscher also developed a sense of guilt, which many some of the other writers in the book, especially Maxime Rodinson, did not, revisiting his former anti-Zionism. And he wrote the following. He wrote, Israelis who have known me as an anti-Zionist of long standing are curious to hear what I think about Zionism. I have, of course, long since abandoned my anti-Zionism, which was based on a confidence in the European labor movement, or more broadly, in European society and civilization, which that society and civilization have not justified. If, instead of arguing against Zionism in the 1920s and 1930s, I had urged European Jews to go to Israel, I might have helped to save some of the lives that were later extinguished in Hitler's gas chambers. He added, thus, for the remnants of European Jewry, is it only for them? The Jewish state has become a historic necessity. It is also a living reality. Still, he insisted, I am not a Zionist. The Israelis accept this with unexpected tolerance, but seem bewildered by it. And I'll just read a little bit about Noam Chomsky. As with Marx, there is an early Chomsky and a late Chomsky, particularly when it comes to Israel and Palestine. Chomsky began publicly addressing the conflict in 1969 with a speech to the Arab Club at MIT. It was reprinted in Liberation, a leading journal of the New Left. His views remained fairly consistent until 1975. In this period, he expressed his oft-stated and still held position that a majority Jewish state is by definition undemocratic, despite the fact that many of the left-wing Israeli journalists on whose work he depends hold the opposite view. Quote, the belief that a Jewish state with non-Jewish citizens can be a democracy guaranteeing equal rights is not at all tenable, he wrote. But he also contended, in contrast to the left's laser-like animus toward Zionism, that, quote, Israel is a state like any other. Zionism is a national movement like any other. He endorsed the Zionist belief that, quote, a normal human existence demands a national home. And he had few illusions, though this would change, about the Palestinian movement. The Palestine Liberation Organization, he noted in 1974, quote, remains opposed to any plan that involves recognition of Israel or reconciliation with it. It seeks to, quote, liquidate every aspect of Israeli society. Chomsky described this program as suicidal, hopelessly irrational, and insane. It was also morally heinous, for it would involve, he wrote in 1970, quote, the destruction by force of a unified society, its people, and its institutions, a consequence intolerable to civilized opinion on the left or elsewhere. He warned the left against mistaking the Israel-Palestine conflict for the anti-colonial struggles in Algeria or Vietnam. And he criticized the PLO's plan for a secular democratic state in mandatory Palestine, the so-called one-state solution, noting that such a configuration would be neither secular nor democratic, nor would it be binational. Quote, what they have in mind, Chomsky bluntly explained, is an Arab state. In 1974, he advised fellow leftists not to conflate their political vision with that of the PLO. He wrote, the Palestinian movement is sometimes described in the West as a movement of revolutionary socialists, but this is far from an accurate characterization. How to untie the Gordian knot of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has demoralized so many, including, I believe, Chomsky. Beginning in the early 1980s, Chomsky devised a new solution, or rather a new analysis. Though he has claimed that his views on Israel and Palestine have remained largely constant, a dubious virtue in any case, in fact, he embarked on a radically new direction. From that point, and continuing to this day, Chomsky has claimed that in the mid-1970s, the PLO, an umbrella of various, often murderously warring groups representing disparate constituencies, had in effect performed an abrupt about-face. So too had the entire Arab world, which Chomsky depicts as a unified bloc, despite the viciousness, then as now, of its interstate conflicts. Chomsky argued that starting precisely in January 1976, the PLO and the Arab nations accepted Israel and sought a peaceful political two-state solution. He specifically included the Iraqi, Syrian, and Libyan dictatorships in this Pacific coalition. He has adhered to this analysis ever since and has more recently extended it to include Hamas and Iran, who he insists support a two-state solution and are working for it. Who in the world would rebuff this admirable axis of peace? According to Chomsky, it has been intransigently opposed by all American presidents, including Obama, all Israeli leaders, including Rabin, and all political Israeli tendencies, including the Labor Party, socialist Zionist groups, and organizations like Peace Now. He has repeatedly vilified the Israeli left, including peace activists such as the late Amos Oz, whom he particularly detests, as rejectionists. Indeed, in Fateful Triangle, his longest and most sustained work on Israel and Palestine, Chomsky argues that the, quote, very goal of Zionism from its earliest days has been that of, quote, avoiding any political settlement, an odd description of the movement that accepted partition as early as 1937. Conversely, he claims that the Arab states have presented a virtual unified front for peace. For instance, he approvingly cites Saddam Hussein's peaceful intentions towards Israel and chastises the Jewish state for refusing to respond positively to him. This was the same Saddam who funded the most murderous Palestinian terrorist groups and who would attack Tel Aviv with Scud missiles. In constructing a world where Arab dictators and PLO militants spent decades seeking peace and Amos Oz opposed it, Chomsky has, unsurprisingly, been forced to ignore the actual history of the conflict. Though a leftist, Chomsky is anything but a materialist. For instance, he makes no mention of the rise and the power of the Palestinian Rejectionist Front, whose name was self-explanatory, of the PLO's non-negotiable rejection of the 1981 Saudi proposal because it implied the recognition of Israel, of the so-called phase strategy through which the establishment of a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza was publicly articulated by many Palestinian intellectuals as the first step toward the elimination of Israel, in essence, a Trojan horse. Chomsky also virtually ignores the Palestinian movement's many decades of terrorism, which have led even left-wing Israelis to often despair of compromise. The foundation of Chomsky's analysis is not the actual on-the-ground, highly complex history of this conflict and this region. Rather, Chomsky rests his argument almost completely, dare I say religiously, on a little-known and never-passed United Nations resolution of January 1976. How does Chomsky explain the fact that this history has been so misunderstood, indeed so hidden? Why is the truth, quote, virtually unknown in the United States, and one might add, everywhere else? After all, in the 1970s and 80s, the PLO was not an unknown or little-noticed independence movement. The Palestinians were not the East Timorese or the Kurds. On the contrary, the PLO was awash in cash, prestige, and attention. It was recognized by more countries than recognized the State of Israel. Its pronouncements and actions regularly landed on the front pages of all the major Western and Israeli newspapers, as well as in the censored presses of the Soviet bloc and the Arab countries. The PLO had consulates, sometimes embassies, in cities throughout the world. Yasser Arafat freely expounded on his ideas in long interviews to everyone from Oriana Fallaci to Playboy magazine. For Chomsky, the disappearance of the supposedly true history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is neither a problem nor a mystery. It is an asset. For Chomsky, as for all conspiracy theorists, the less well-known something is, the more likely it is to be true. Thus he writes darkly of how the manufacturers of consent have interred the corpse of the conflict. The 1976 resolution, he writes, has been vetoed from history. But the odd thing is that leftist journalists and historians, including those who are extremely critical of Israel, strong supporters of the Palestinian cause, and noted scholars of the region have apparently participated in this enormous cover-up. Okay, I will stop there.
So you set out to discover on a journey of why Zionism cannot be uttered in polite society. So by looking at those thinkers and their writings, some of them wrote in the 1940s and 1950s,
Yes.
did it provide you with an answer, a sense of...
It provided me with a certain answers. I can't say complete answers, and I'm always a little suspicious of any historian or political theorist or whatever who believes they have the complete answer to any question, certainly one as knotty as this. I think that there are many reasons. First off, in the Marxist left was traditionally very, very anti-nationalist, and of course believed that all nationalisms would die. Of course, the exact opposite became true. So many people on the left, including many Jewish Marxists, were traditionally anti-Zionist, and they believed that Jews should stay in the countries in which they lived and build the revolution there, and that would lead to the end of anti-Semitism. Of course, the Holocaust put a huge wrench in that theory. So there had been a lot of debate and a lot of suspiciousness about Zionism, I think, way before the State of Israel. In 1948, I think that much of the left does, in fact, become pro-Zionist. And this is partially due to the Holocaust. It's partially due to the fact that the Soviet Union votes for partition. But I think that there are other reasons also. The left became very challenged in its anti-nationalism with the rise of the anti-colonial movements in the Third World. And of course, the left felt that it had to support those movements against colonialism, that these were just movements. But those movements were also tended to be rabidly nationalistic, very, very aggressively nationalistic, especially in the Arab world. And I think that one of the things that happened is that the critique of Zionism allowed many leftists to maintain a critique of nationalism, albeit only in terms of this one tiny country. So to maintain their anti-nationalist bona fides, but at the same time still keep supporting the Third World revolutions. I think there are many other reasons that come into play, but that is two of them. The occupation, of course, the '67 war, does a lot to turn many people, for understandable reasons, into very strong critics of Israel and of Zionism. But again, there's a sort of paradox there, because at that time, and this is something that Fred Halliday began to realize and really struggle with, while the left became very critical of Israel's denial of human rights to Palestinians, it remained very, very strong supporters of all sorts of dictatorships that were much fiercer in their denial of human rights. Syria, Algeria, I mean, the list goes, Iraq, the list goes on, China. The list goes on and on. So again, one cannot say that it was the occupation per se that I think is really at the crux of the critique. It's part of the critique, but there's too much of a contradiction between the critique of the occupation and the support of so many other third world revolutions. And I think you see this either today. I'm sort of stunned by the fact that you can find many more people on the left who support Assad's right to rule Syria than support the right of Israel to exist. And I think that is a contradiction that the left has simply not been able to work out. So there are, I think, many reasons, and I spent many years on the book trying to figure them all out. In someone like Deutscher, you saw he was sort of contorted with contradiction, because he had to maintain that Zionism is nationalism, and he's against nationalism, he's against Zionism, but he also understands, oh my God, look what's happened to our people. And he remained very strongly in his identification with what he called the Jewish tragedy, even though, especially with the 1967 war, he became a very fierce critic of Israel. So with him, I think you see the real torment of certain leftist intellectuals of that era. And of course, he kept going back to Israel. He had a publisher in Israel. He lectured in Yiddish when he was in Israel. And so again, he had a kind of emotional tie, although intellectually he insisted that he was not a Zionist.
When you write about some of the thinkers in this book, you write about their championing the idea of assimilation, which you look at critically. But then, if I may add something, you
Yes.
also write about yourself towards the end of the book, that I too am a product of the diaspora, and in some ways the processes of assimilation. So if you can maybe address...
Yeah, so I am a product of the diaspora. My grandfather came from a long line of Lithuanian rabbis. My father could read Hebrew. I do not read Hebrew, so you see definitely a process of assimilation. I have nothing against the diaspora. I mean, I think the diaspora has, especially in the U.S., I don't think any group of Jews has ever been as fortunate as we Jews have been in the U.S. What I'm critical of are anti-Zionists or leftists in the U.S. who sort of romanticize the diaspora without realizing what it meant for previous generations of Jews, and who seem to take the position of American Jews as quote, quote, normal. Our position, I think, is quite abnormal if you look at Jewish history. So for my grandparents, the diaspora was not great. They fled from Russia and from Lithuania. From anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm very critical of are especially of American Jews on the left, who seem to have no understanding at all of what the situation of most Jews has been, including the 800,000 Jews who were kicked out of the Arab world with the founding of Israel. And they, of course, had lived in those countries for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. I'm also critical of people like Maxime Rodinson and Kessler, who believed that the best thing for Jews and for the happiness of the whole world were for the Jewish people to disappear. One of the things that Kessler loved about Israel, when he did love Israel, is that he thought it would lead to the disappearance of the Jewish people, which I know sounds like a very mad theory, but of course that actually was his theory. He associated Jewishness with cravenness, with obsequiousness, with cowardice. And so since native Israelis seem to not have those characteristics, he concluded that they were in fact not Jewish. And so by a sort of sleight of hand, Israel solved the Jewish problem by not being Jewish at all. So I am very critical. Maxime Rodinson also, and this is a sort of traditional Marxist idea, of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Maxim Rodinson very, very strongly believed that the Jews should disappear as a people, that there should be complete assimilation of Jews into the larger society, and he resented the fact that, in his view, Israel had led to a resurgence not just of Jewish nationalism, but of identification, of Western Jews identifying as Jews. He resented that very, very bitterly, and he insisted that assimilation had in fact succeeded until the birth of Israel, which he thought was the stumbling block to assimilation. But he could never explain that if assimilation had succeeded, why were his parents deported to Auschwitz? If their assimilation had been so complete, if in fact they had been so accepted by their neighbors. And that was something that he could never, not only could he never explain, but although he talked a lot about his parents and his upbringing, his parents' death was something that he never even mentioned. I should say also that a lot of his views, he was very, very strongly identified with the Arab world. He was a true scholar of the Arab world. And the Arab world saved his life just as the British saved Deutscher's life, because right before Germany invaded France, he gets a teaching job in Syria. And he spends the war years in Syria and in Lebanon. And that really saves his life. And he had very, very warm feelings towards the Arab world. I should say, though, that interestingly, although he was a very, very staunch anti-Zionist, he really loathed Israel, he also, though, became a two-stater. And he felt that the abolition of Israel as a homeland for Jewish people was a step too far and would lead to too much violence. So there are a lot of contradictions in these writers, in these thinkers, and what I came to love about them were those contradictions. Even the ones who I don't love, I loved for that. And I guess I find the debates in the left or among progressives or whatever you want to call oneself today to be much, much more strident and reductive than the debates among these intellectuals were. So one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was to sort of uncover a history of richer, deeper, less vitriolic, more dialectical, if I can use that word, debates in the left, and hope that maybe those of us who consider ourselves of the left, progressives, liberals, whatever, that kind of debate could be, that we can refine, that we can revitalize that kind of debate. Because I see, especially teaching at a university, as I do, how reductive, how one-dimensional I think debates over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have become.
Now, in the final chapter, you bring us up to today in many ways. And you provide your own definition of Zionism. So you say Zionism is the right of the Jews to an independent state, but you also say democratic state. That's part of your definition. And in fact, you have your own conflicted position as is articulated in the final chapter. So can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, I plead guilty to conflict. I'm no less conflicted than the people I write about, although maybe in different ways. One of the themes of my book is that so often when writers have addressed Israel or thinkers have addressed Israel, they tend to sort of drift into fantasy. So you see that with Arendt, you see that with Kessler in very different ways. You see that with many of these writers. They have fantasies about the conflict. They're often projecting other histories. For Arendt, it was the history of Weimar Germany. She's projecting onto Israel. And I think that both Israelis and Palestinians have a fantasy, that each of them has the fantasy that the other will sort of disappear. Clearly not. And yet there still, I think, is that fantasy, especially among the extremes on both sides, but even I think in the middle on both sides. So the book is partially a sort of call to the reality principle. My own conflicts about Israel, or my own griefs about Israel, are to see what I believe to be the original Zionist vision being slowly or not so slowly eradicated, and the state becoming more and more of a bastion of intolerance of the right, a complete, I think, unwillingness, inability to deal realistically with the occupation and how to end it. I know that my friends in Israel are really in despair about the attacks on civil liberties, not within Israel proper, not even discussing the occupation, but they see those things as very, very, very linked. So that Israel, which did start really as a social democratic state, has become, I think, a very different one. That does not, for me, lead me to question its, quote, right to exist, just as I think the United States has a right to exist under President Trump. We still have a right to exist. And I think one of the very peculiar things about the Israeli-Palestinian or Israeli-Arab conflict is that Israel really is the only country I can think of whose, quote, right to exist has ever been questioned. There are many, many states that hate each other. Let's say India and Pakistan hate each other's guts. Each of them wishes the other would go away, probably, but they don't actually question the right of each other to exist. But with Israel, that is still very, very much of a question for many, many people on the left, and obviously many people in the Arab world. So my own conflicts have to do with a sense of allegiance to a country that I believe is on a completely disastrous path. And that is a obviously tormented place to be.
So at this point, we'd like to open up the conversation and have people in the audience ask questions.
We're going to have a mic on each side, and please wait till we come to you and acknowledge you. Let's start.
Hi, thank you. I wonder if you have a little bit, but I wonder if you could speak more to whether and how researching and writing this book has changed you.
Well, I'm a lot older and a lot more tired than when I started it. That's an interesting question. I mean, I would have to go through each person, which I won't do now. But I think the two people that surprised me most in researching it were Arendt and Chomsky, to see how, I mean, they are the two figures, when I talk about fantasy, are the most extreme examples of that. In terms of my own development, it made me, well, one of the things that one has to do if you're writing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is read a lot about the Palestinian movement, not just the Zionist movement. And one of the things that I learned much more about was what a truly, truly disastrous movement and disastrous leadership the Palestinians have had. I believe in the right of the Palestinians to have a state, but it is hard to find a worse movement. And many of the writers who I used for that history are themselves either Palestinian or Arab. And it's very interesting to see that although they are very strong supporters of the Palestinian cause, they view the movement as a complete catastrophe. So my views on that changed, and I think a sense, one of the things I'm left with in terms of bewilderment is the stubbornness of the fantasy factor. I am somewhat stunned by that. And you see it time and time again with people proposing, quote, solutions that are completely unguided by the actual situation on the ground. In some ways, perhaps the Jewish people, play a role in modern thought as a sort of a fantasy in many ways, certainly of anti-Semites, but not only them. So maybe that's not so surprising. But I was sort of humbled by a lot of the history that I read.
We have a question here.
I do, yes. Thank you very much. I think it's my turn. Hello? Here I am.
Right here.
Ah,
she's
hi.
looking. Hi. She
These
was
lights
looking
are very
for me.
bright.
So I'm sitting here saying to myself, okay, so you have two messianic traditions, the Judaism and the left. And the left includes a lot of people who are or were Jewish. Do you think it's worth adding a question about competition between messianic traditions to this whole issue?
A competition between Judaism and Zionism?
Judaism and the left. Two messianic traditions.
Yeah. So I don't know if there's a competition. I mean, there's a whole theory, of course, that Marx, who of course was a very assimilated Jew, but that Marx really takes the messianic tradition of Judaism and secularizes it, and communism becomes the messianic tradition of the 20th century. I don't think there's necessarily a competition between them. What I was struck by is that the early Zionists, the early socialist Zionists, the people who really build the state, were pretty unmessianic. I actually think that they were pretty sober in many ways in their Zionism and in their vision. I think that the really, I mean, I suppose there was always a thread of the messianic in Zionism, but I think what we would call messianic Zionism really develops after 1967. And I think, someone like Ben-Gurion, who actually believed that the Palestinian territory should not be kept, he was like, we need to get rid of them. I think that generation, you may know more about this than I, Eran, but that generation, I think, was quite shocked by this messianic Zionism and religious Zionism. The early Zionists were not only were they atheists, but they essentially viewed religion, the Jewish religion, as the opium of the Jewish people. And so what we think of as messianic Zionism now, the settlers, some secular, many religious, I think really comes to the fore after 67. But I don't think there's any competition between Judaism and Marxism. I mean, Marxism you could see as a sort of secularization of certain Jewish traditions. Yeah.
On this side.
Could you possibly comment on the influence of U.S. foreign policy? Like in the 50s, Israel was the enemy of the Republican Party, and now it's the darling of the Republican Party. And the most right-wing conservatives embrace Israel, whereas 50 years ago they might have lynched Jews.
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm hoping to do in my book is to change the narrative of what being, quote, pro-Jewish means, and that it should not be something that the right, I mean, Sheldon Adelson should not be allowed to define what it means to be pro-Jewish. And or pro-Israel, I mean. And I remember in the 1960s, my parents had a house. My father was an old leftist, and my parents had a house at Fire Island, and they were very much against the Vietnam War. And every July 4th, my father would put my father was a veteran from World War II, and every July 4th, he would put the American flag out. And he would say, don't let the bastards own the flag. The flag is for us. I fought for the flag. We own the flag. And I feel the same way. I mean, that, yes, I mean, the right now sort of dominates or describes what it means to be, quote, pro-Israel. And I think it's really, there are some organizations like J Street that I think are really trying to put forth a different definition of what it means to be pro-Israel. But it is true that the more the right does that, I think the more the left flees from being pro-Israel. But I think that that's wrong, and that's allowing the wrong people to define. It's like Trump defining what it means to be pro-American. My idea of being pro-American is different than his. He doesn't get to define. He's not the only arbiter of what it means to be pro-American or what it means to be patriotic. And so I think the same thing. Also, a lot of these Republicans are pro-Israel for sort of anti-Semitic reasons, or at least the evangelists are. They believe the final battle and the coming of Christ and all that. So I think one of the things that I hope my book can do a little bit towards is trying to define what it means to be pro-Israel in a different way. And you can also be pro-Israel and also be very critical of Israel, just as you can be pro-American and very critical of America.
Next question is back here in the left.
Back there, all the way back.
Thank you. The difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism sometimes can be very slippery, and that many people say that that distinction can be made when you apply a test to Israel that couldn't or isn't applied to other countries. You made that allusion with respect to Syria and China and how they get a pass with respect to their repressive policies, but Israel is singled out, and that would be defined as anti-Semitism because the standard is different. Now we have a resurgence or a new youth in the Democratic Party that applies a standard of anti-Israel or critical of Israel. And I was wondering if you thought that that definition has some validity with respect to the new left, because the topic is the left, the new left in the Democratic Party.
So I'm of different thoughts about that. I think that there is an obsession with Israel for sure. On the other hand, Israel defines itself as a democratic country, which Syria does not, and China does not. And so in some ways, we do expect more from Israel. I expect more from Israel than I expect from Syria. And I think it's fine to expect more from Israel. And I think that Israelis expect more of Israel than Syrians expect of Syria in some sense. I do think what bothers me is two things, is the sort of obsession, a kind of laser-like focus on Israel. I went to a meeting. My university has a campus in Abu Dhabi, of all horrible places, where there's terrible political repression. And there was a meeting about Abu Dhabi, about what we should do about Abu Dhabi, and everyone kept talking about Israel. It's almost like it was like a Pavlovian reaction. They couldn't concentrate on Abu Dhabi for more than 62 seconds. And then they started talking about Israel. So that I think is anti-Semitic. I don't think that expecting Israel to live up to democratic ideals, though, is anti-Semitic at all. I do expect that. It's not doing that. It is failing miserably in that. And yes, I expect that of Israel, and I don't expect that of Syria. So I think it's criticism of, I think in a way, too much time is spent on whether criticism is or isn't anti-Semitic. I think it's sort of like affirmative action. There are some critics of affirmative action who are racist, and there are other critics of affirmative action who aren't racist. So the question isn't, I think, whether you're going to label someone anti-Semitic. The question is, what is the program that they're putting forth, and who is it useful to? So I don't think that someone like Chomsky is anti-Semitic, in fact. I think he's sort of crazily off base, but I don't think he's an anti-Semite. But whether he is or isn't, I think, isn't really the crucial question. The crucial question is, what is he advocating and why, and who is listening to him?
Thank you.
But I think we should continue to expect a lot of Israel and realize that it's failing in many, many ways.
Susie, back here.
Yes.
Okay, the reason for my coming here today is that I wanted to learn how these fringe ideas had become mainstream in the Democratic Party, and what direction do you see it going in? Do you think that the members of the Democratic Party in Congress will ever, display swastikas, or do you think they'll ever deny the Holocaust? And would there be any criticism of them if they were to do so from the Democratic leadership?
I do not think they will ever deny the Holocaust or display swastikas.
Question.
I have a lot of worries, but that is not one.
Question
today.
over here on the left in the center.
Hi. I'm over here. Sorry, I'll stand up.
Hi.
Hi. I'm also an academic, kind of in a similar field of cultural studies. I'm struggling with why people are reading Chomsky and why people like Judith Butler have such a strong influence on the way that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is understood on campuses. Andrew Ross, NYU, the way that BDS is having, the votes on the night of Passover at Tufts, and how they can actually deal with that hypocrisy of kind of boycotting Tel Aviv campus, not worrying about Abu Dhabi. Anyway, but I would actually like to know intellectually why you think, is it the flight to fantasy that Chomsky and Hannah Arendt, but those are the people who my colleagues are reading and citing in creating a one-state solution.
Where do you
advocacy.
teach?
I'm local, but yeah, I've been on the East Coast as well.
So Chomsky, I think, Chomsky has a unified worldview, and I think that can be very alluring, especially to young people, because he sort of can explain the whole world, even if the explanation has very little to do with the world. And that's not just in terms of Israel either. His ideas about the rest of the Middle East are actually equally crazy. He's an advocate of what he calls the no-state solution for the Middle East. He seems to not have noticed that all of the Arab countries, in fact, have imploded, that they are no longer states. So, it is a unified worldview. And by seeing U.S. power as the evil of the world, which is basically the essence of his worldview, also is a weird way of endowing students, I think, with power. Because if the U.S. is the world's most evil actor in the world, then we could do something about that and make the world better. So in a weird way, he speaks to a kind of idealism and a kind of cynicism at the same time. And I think that's why he is so influential. You can sort of read Chomsky and then you understand everything about the world. And what I love about the other writers in this book, other than he, is that they didn't have those one-size-fits-all solutions. BDS, criticism of Israel, it's a very easy thing to do. First off, Israel is doing some very bad things. The oppression of the Palestinians, Can you elaborate on that? Yeah, I will. I will. My ideas on that. But it's also become, I do think it's become a form of radical chic, that sort of to be with BDS, to be anti-Israel is to be woke. And there's a lot of horrible history. I talk a little bit about this at the beginning of the book that's just regurgitated constantly. So at my university, the graduate student union endorsed BDS. And in their statement, they said Israel was created in 1948 as a Jewish-only state. Well, that's 20% of Israel from the beginning was Arab, was Palestinian with full voting rights. They were citizens. And these are like the future history professors of tomorrow. So it's just terrible, terrible history. It's like a game of telephone that they pass on to each other. Israel was created by imperialists, it just gets passed on. I think it has become a very easy thing. I mean, I've written some about photographs coming out from Syria and debates about Syria. I mean, here you have just an absolute catastrophe, which I think future generations will look at us and say, what did we or didn't we do? And there's zero interest in that. That's an incredibly complicated, very hard thing to deal with. Israel and the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in some sense, is actually easier, I think, to deal with than with much of what's other things going on in the world. And I think that, young people, and I love my students. My students, by the way, are, from what I know, are not BDS people. But I also think that when you're young, it's really hard to speak out against the group. It's just a very, very difficult thing to do. And there are things that I agree with on Andrew Ross in terms of campus politics, but I can't stand his ideas on BDS and Israel, etc. So I think for a lot of people, they see, oh, someone's right about X, they must be right about Y. And one of the things that I try at least to instill in my students, I'm sure you do too, is a kind of independence of thought and to stop equating things that aren't equated. Hannah Arendt wrote, and this is one of the things I admire her for, she said that, she wrote, I'm paraphrasing now, but she said the beginning of wisdom is to understand that A is not B, i.e. that to distinguish is what's so important. Israel is in fact not like South Africa. It's sort of hard to think of two countries that are more different. So the equation between the two makes absolutely no sense politically. But I just think that it's very, very, very hard when there's a sort of groupthink about something to begin to think more independently and to really investigate the history. I sort of wrote my book hoping that my students and younger people would read it, because I think it's very, very hard to change the mind of anyone older, to tell the truth. But young people can maybe begin to see things in a different way.
Thank you. We have time for just one more question. I'm sorry, folks. And a reminder that Susie's going to be in the back of the room signing books. Stick around for that, Becky.
Last question over here on the left.
Given the comments that you just made, can you picture a non-apartheid Israel that identifies itself as a Jewish state? How do you picture that existing, given the numerical distribution of where they are and the history of that land over several thousand years? In other words, how is Israel going to accomplish being a Jewish state, self-identified, where Jews are the majority, and it's not yet an apartheid state?
Yeah, I think the word apartheid doesn't really have much to do with Israel, in all honesty. Again, I think that that's a word taken from South Africa that doesn't really apply to Israel. I don't see any contradiction between Israel being a Jewish majority state and also with its Palestinian citizens, whether Muslim or Christian, having full rights. They haven't achieved that, but we have not achieved, let's say, African Americans also having full rights. So theoretically, to me, there's no contradiction at all between those two things. My worries about Israel are not that. The problem is that it is not going in that direction. It's going in the direction of especially with this new law, of defining the Arab citizens as second class, which I think is heinous. But that's a more recent development. To me, there's no contradiction at all between a Jewish majority state and a state where all citizens have equal rights.
Okay. Thank you very much, Susie.
Thank you.
And I'd like to invite everybody to the book signing in the back of the room.